So, I really start from the beginning of just stating what we all know well, which is that climate change is one of the most prominent and existential challenges of the 21st century. It's a threat multiplier. We know well that it weaves through many other critical issues: public health, food, animal rights, foreign policy, poverty, immigration, so forth and so on. It really is a collective action problem. And it's a consequence of our shared behaviors that cut to the heart of how we live, work, play, relax in society. And so it's important to find common ground on these challenges. And while we have made a tremendous amount of progress generally in the scientific way of understanding climate change, causes and consequences, I've argued in my most recent book, and I will do here, that climate communications and conversations about climate change in our lives remain comparatively underdeveloped and stuck. Oftentimes, here in the United States, for example, many people don't talk about climate change. There are polling numbers that we can turn to here in the United States from Yale University and George Mason that have found that upwards of 60% of people here in this country discuss climate change with family and friends rarely or never. So one of the most fundamental ways in which we can make progress here is to have the courage to hold those conversations as potential pathways to enhanced engagement and action. And I want to focus in my comments in my presentation, as the title suggests, on a part of those important communications and engaging with those that are called contrarians or deniers or skeptics, part of climate change, contrarian counter movements, as it's been called in many other ways. I liked how Timmons had talked about it as obstructionists as well. We can think about these terms, and there's definitely important ways to break these things down, but I'll leave it there for now, of just focusing in on how these communications can get derailed by contrarians. And I did add on here, I don't want to just simply diagnose things, but I want to talk about how we can get past this, how we can address it more adequately as well. And so in doing this, I just, I do want to acknowledge that we have a dominant way of knowing and talking about climate change in the 20th century, or the 21st century. This can be tracked back to the 20th century in terms of defining the problem as pollution and relying on scientific reports, scientific research to help fill knowledge gaps and provide information about what is at stake, what is going on in the climate on planet Earth. And so from this, I know several of you may be familiar with the notion that the information deficit model emerges. This is one where many then take up the position that if we can just give people more information, they will do the right thing. But why can't we just get everyone to do the right thing? Why can't this increasing batch of scientific reports provide enough insight for us all to move in the right direction? So, there are very many logical ways why we have traditionally relied upon information deficit model. And then, some of them are just simply that we need more information in order to make better decisions, better behaviors. But we can also actually start to look a little bit more critically at how natural physical scientists can take up this privileged role and really actually get comfortable with this place of expertise and authority. And I say this with full knowledge, and I don't want to denigrate our natural physical science colleagues. I sit in a research institute with over 800 researchers who are predominantly natural physical scientists. But it is important to just note that this deficit model we have known for many decades now within the social sciences and humanities scholars in these communities, that it is a deficient way of approaching these issues. Nonetheless, as Brian Wynn and STS scholars pointed out, the deficit model is dead. Long live the deficit model. This actually is a bit of a cheeky comment from him, a humorous comment, I should say, that reaches back to the 1400s when Charles VI died and was replaced by Charles VII. And it was a phrase just to point to the notion that while one moves out of the way, another thing carries on, and some things just don't change. And so this deficit model has persisted because, this can be a way to then blame lack of support or action on people just not understanding things well enough. It then can become this notion of a precondition for taking action. But the grim reality is that we know that climate change is a vexing, complicated, and difficult threat, and require us to think beyond just the science itself. So relying solely on the science, for those who are familiar with, say, IKEA, a big box store, you could think about another place that you go to buy furniture that you have to put together. It's like relying solely on science is like relying solely on the directions to put together that shelf. The information is there, yes, but there's other elements that stand between you and, say, your finished bookshelf. And so focusing only on scientific ways of knowing has provided limited ability to communicate effectively about climate change. Hitting people over the head with these scientific reports, as we know, doesn't work for everyone. It's a 20th century communication model, this notion of dumbing it down for the general public. And we can even kind of tether it back to Enlightenment thinking that scientific facts and techno-rationality guide optimal decision-making. Scholars like Sheila Jasanoff have really helped us better understand the way in which these considerations around scientific ways of knowing have been developed and entrenched. So, but returning to the idea of why can't people just do the right thing, there are several reasons why. And there are several reasons why we need to be reaching beyond science. And so in the book that Nuria had very graciously mentioned, I start chapter 3 with this quote from Antonio Guterres. He says, "Climate change is the defining issue of our time. We're at a defining moment. Scientists have been telling us for decades, over and over again, and far too many leaders have refused to listen." So we wouldn't listen. Is that the problem that we're facing here? It can be a comfortable and appealing way to frame the gap between science and society, that scientists can package up this information just neatly for policy action. But there is this niggling frustration that why can't we just listen and do the right thing? It is because it's much more complicated than that. And so the thread that I want to pull through for us here is that one of the dimensions of this that's very important is that in solely relying on this scientific way of knowing, or relying in this dominant way, gives contrarians or skeptics or obstructionists a great deal of power. It's much easier to pollute the waters of productive discourse, of public understanding, when one can point to science and disagreeing with the science, whether it's interpretation or implicatory denial, if you think about it through the work of Carrie Norgard. And so it's limited our abilities to communicate. And so, in the book, I make connections between patterns of practice, social networks, climate contrarians, and climate counter movements in the United States, but I do take some time to compare and contrast them with conditions elsewhere. And the book is largely an opportunity for me to pull together a great deal of scholarship from many of you that are here today. And so just though thinking about how contrarians can thrive in this environment, that this evidentiary disagreement of orthodox views of science help them with this drive to amplify their outlier views, that at times some of it's driven by self-perceived notoriety, where they achieve celebrity status by taking up these contrarian, you can say sometimes annoying, you can say beyond that, just very destructive perspectives that can break down productive discourse in the public arena. And so this, instead of maybe suffocating with more science, actually can provide oxygen and strength to the outlier claims. Now, don't get me wrong, scientific ways of knowing are critically important. Gaining more information about the climate environment around us is vital to ongoing work. With the upcoming IPCC 6th assessment report, I will say that I've been contributing to it as a contributing author, and writing on media and writing on some of these elements, and trying to bring some of this better understanding of a contrarian's influence in political economy into that report. But relying predominantly on the scientific ways of knowing still limit our capacity to move forward. And so Suzanne Mosier has talked about this in terms of providing information and filling knowledge gaps is at best necessary, but rarely sufficient to create active behavioral engagement. And I would add to her comment that we need sustained behavioral engagement. And, even with this in mind, I don't know if folks in other places are familiar with this website called Nextdoor. And this is popular in some places in the United States, where neighbors in certain communities can talk with each other through the internet, especially during the pandemic. And I share with you a clip that my mother sent me just this morning, and I thought it could be interesting to share with you here. And this comes from one of her neighbors in Tucson, Arizona, or near Tucson, Arizona, named Lon Roberts. And if you take a moment to read that, Lon Roberts is taking issue with climate change for scientific reasons traced back to the 1970s. You may have heard these arguments before about how they said we're heading into a global ice age. And boy, were they wrong. So Lon Roberts remains skeptical of the science. He remains someone who is not willing to take on board new information about scientific dimensions of climate change. And so there are many Lon Roberts in all of our communities. And so how do we productively engage with them? Maybe through this portal or otherwise. By just trying to debate him on the science, I suspect, as others have done, which according to my mother has been going back and forth over this portal Nextdoor. But it leads to more entrenched perspectives. It probably very rarely is going to change Lon Roberts' mind. And again, referring to Carrie Norgard, talking about there's literal denial, just not willing to hear it. There is interpretive denial, which apparently Lon Roberts maybe interprets things differently. And there's implicatory denial, which if you take this on board, it will necessitate changes in our lives that we may not be willing to take on board. So maybe Lon Roberts suffers from some of this as well. I put a little cartoon to the left. You may recognize this person as Rex Tillerson, the previous Exxon CEO. And if we just think about maybe some of the things that Rex Tillerson and some of the stances that he has taken up across that spectrum may take on a very different perspective than our neighbor, Lon Roberts. And I can imagine that Lon Roberts, when he posted this, didn't think I'd say the name. He'd be mentioned so many times in an international conference about climate contrarianism, but here we are today. And so we have to think about how we engage with and how we discuss this range of contrarian perspectives. There are research communities within us all that feel as though our work is done once we've introduced our research into the world, we've written it up, we've published it. It's soothing to take that view. But there is this need for ongoing dialogue. There is this need for listening to others' perspectives and for talking through and enlarging these possibilities for change. It's not a matter of overthrowing the deficit model, but it's expanding and enriching these perspectives to meet people where they are and be more creative to engage not just through the science, which seem to be resisted in these cases that I bring up, but then also through, say, emotions, tactile, visceral, tangible, affective, aesthetic ways of learning and knowing about the changing climate around us. And that doesn't rely solely on the science. So we could, I could continue to go off on a tangent about whether you ignore somebody like Lon Roberts or whether you engage with him. And there's always a time and a place for everything. But when you then start to talk about influential actors in carbon-based economy and society like Rex Tillerson, there are necessities to engage in particular ways. And what I argue here is that by relying just on the science, you really overlook many of the values that are underlying that engagement. And so, I think that as we then expand out from our conversations over the last 2 days, that thinking about communications, that we should think carefully about what gives contrarian perspectives oxygen, what then gives them amplified perspective in the public arena. And I've written a fair bit on media, how media have amplified those outlier voices over time. And so I'm encouraging us through this work and others to be more creative and hence effective. As just a part of this work, Justin Farrell, who's at Yale University, he and I had done a bit of research that I captured in the book, but then also had contributed to an edited volume that Nuria had put together with others. And we had just sought to trace this through media attention. We traced, I think it was 11 different contrarian organizations through major media, US media outlets. And so it was a good opportunity to then take a look at the ebbs and flows of media coverage of climate change. On the figure on the left, you can see which ones gained greater traction in the media landscape over the years, over the 30-year period. On the right, if I gave you more time with that, you could see that this isn't just, say, for instance, a right-wing media problem in terms of amplifying outlier perspectives. Just in broad terms of how often they're invoked, the light blue refers to the Washington Post. And these contrarian counter-movement organizations were mentioned by the Washington Post much more in the last years of our monitoring than, say, Fox News in black. And so this points to the fact that we just can't name and shame and blame certain specific actors and absolve ourselves from the responsibility to engage meaningfully and smartly with contrarian communities, that this is part of work that we all need to engage in. And this work that Justin and I did, and I'm sharing with you, we didn't get into the nuance of how the Washington Post were covering these organizations. It could have very well been in many cases that they were accurately labeled as outlier perspectives, but nonetheless, as they continue to get this media traction, that gives them that oxygen if they are further, and that also helps them with their funding. So, filling knowledge gaps is important. Back to the IKEA example, I suppose, of putting together furniture, something that you buy that you have to put together. It's not as though you have to dialogue with the furniture shop to get this, to get the bookshelf put together while you consider the directions. There are many different ways in which we can develop tactics and strategies to effectively address these contrarian groups and really each other. Basically, collectively, we need to get more innovative in order to effectively communicate about climate change in the public sphere. And this leads to the wider arguments that I put forward in my book, and I'll turn to those, time permitting, here just for a little bit. I do want to keep in mind an important caution, though, that comes from Bob Brule, who has done a tremendous amount of work, who's with us here, I believe, about how political economic influences matter. He's commented that we can introduce all kinds of new messages and information into an otherwise unchanged socioeconomic system, and it will accomplish very little. So we need to be keeping in mind the political economic factors as we then start to move through changing the ways in which we're framing these issues, essentially, from scientific ways into other ways. And so When we start to think about expanding pathways, we can think about protest movements. We can think about demonstrations that can generate interest, that can engage with people that otherwise may not be engaging with science. And so here's a few of my favorite protest signs. You can see young people's movements that are coming forward to help engage these experiential, emotional ways of knowing, as I talked about. And so we have science marches, people's climate marches, youth climate strikes that are helping bridge the formal science and policy in to the everyday lived experience, to person in person. These are complex subpolitical spaces. And once we start to do that, I mean, not to overcomplicate things, but you can think about this as a diversity of ways to approach things that builds a more resilient communication system and opportunities for engagement with people across the political, social, economic spectrum. And this too can then strengthen communication approaches that really can diminish the power of contrarians to achieve these amplified outlier perspectives. And so really, here's a few more, just science policy after peer review. And so really thinking about, this is work from Annabella Carvalho, wonderful scholar that many of us know, and Jacqueline Burgess, thinking about ways in which we can engage across this communication circuit. And so there is framing in certain ways. I'm talking about critiquing solely framing climate change as a scientific challenge. We can think about public carrying capacities as forms and texts move into the public sphere above the axis into our own private lives. We can think about how this is dependent upon what else is going on in the world. We can think about how we may resist or find certain messages and ways of discussing this appealing, and that can lead into our own participation. So in the passage of time from left to right, these are opportunities for us to plug in creatively as well as effectively to improve basically the checks in place to avoid that diminished discursive space that gets polluted by climate contrarians oftentimes. So the book, just in brief, seeks to understand what works, where, when, why, under what conditions. I really took an opportunity and the privilege of getting to do this kind of work for a living right now, is that I was able to read a lot of what you've been producing, a lot of what you all have contributed, and integrate those lessons into helping to understand through a handbook and guide how we can make better choices to diminish, as I focus on in chapter 3, the influence of contrarians in the public arena and in science policy deliberations, and how we can then also build out diversity of communication systems. There's not one silver bullet, rather there's silver buckshot, or there's several of these types of metaphors to talk about the strength in many different ways of approaching communications. So among some of them, I'll fairly briefly just share with you that I've engaged in. I'm not just simply analyzing and writing about it. I actually do also experiment in these spaces. This is a way, this is another chapter in the book that talks about ways in which we can expand our registers of communication. And so with our students at the University of Colorado, and primarily with a collaborator, Beth Osnes, who's a professor at here at the University of Colorado in theater and dance, we've actually been using comedy as a vehicle to open up these spaces of engagement. So we've been working on this for the last 6 years, and it's a way for us to experiment on to what extent this can effectively smarten up and improve communications environments as pathways to enhanced action. And so we've gotten our students up on stage in pre-pandemic times. We've analyzed this through our research and through the book as well. We have found that these are ways to break down barriers. These are ways in which we can also wiggle into, poke, prod, and make a nuisance of what are sometimes ridiculous, silly approaches of contrarians in our world, that approaching them with earnestness and approaching some of the arguments, acknowledging that there is a range of these arguments, but approaching them with humor is also another effective way to debilitate and get past some of these just long-standing obstructions that they put in our paths. And so in the pandemic edition, actually this year, we had worked with 16 professional comedians and had them basically get into these writers' rooms with our students. So the picture up on top has Sasha Stewart in the top left, Raleigh Williams to the right, one down, who are professional working comedians that exchanged ideas with our students. And we put together, along with Chuck Nice in the bottom picture, he's co-host of Star Talk here in the United States with Neil deGrasse Tyson. We put together a show that we have now. You can get it on the internet. I could put the link in the chat later if you'd like to watch it. And we also had video competitions with entries from around the world. And it was really fascinating to see how many of these projects actually gravitated towards humorous ways of approaching carbon-based industry and contrarian activities. In fact, our top 2 video winners in the video competition addressed those challenges. If we had more time, I'd show them to you, but I'll put the links in the chat and encourage you to take a look at them and think about how those may have helped to smarten up our ways of communicating about climate change. Now, there's several forms of humor or flavors of humor. These may be punching up in terms of to power, punching down at disadvantaged, or what we've called good nature comedy, thinking about our collective challenges that we all face, the contradictions that we all live in. And so some of the punching up in satire to some of these carbon-based industry interests are still within maybe ways in which we can continue to develop with these different vehicles for effective communication. So as I finish out the book, and I do want to make sure I leave time for us to have conversations, I do try and get to, in a chapter here called Silver Buckshot, try and get to some guidance that can be helpful for all of us going forward, that being authentic in our approaches is critically important. That I could tell you several anecdotes that I write about just of how inauthenticity or, coming in fake ways gets sniffed out very quickly. And so playing to the places in which communication environments in which we add value is important. Being aware of your audience, also very important. Being accurate in what you're discussing, very important. And maybe with Dieter's talk before, it's always on my mind, this idea of the crumbling of consistency, that I still do think that accuracy matters when we're talking about these issues, but perhaps we could have a discussion about that as well. And thinking about these three together, just Steve Schneider, a longtime scientist who's passed away about 10 years ago, talked about this of just knowing thy audience, being aware, knowing thyself, being authentic, and knowing thy stuff, being accurate. In addition, in the realm of creatively engaging, being imaginative and being bold, stepping beyond these, what can be often dry IPCC. Even the summary for policymakers isn't exactly a great, fun read. That being more imaginative and bold and thinking creatively about how we can communicate these challenges is helpful. And then turning to ways in which we can effectively find common ground. I think it is still an open consideration when we're talking about comedy, to what extent are we finding common ground with contrarian communities. I think there's a time and place again for everything, that sometimes certain contrarian perspectives can become the punchline. But overall, finding that common ground remains an important dimension of larger creative climate communication challenges. Emphasizing here and now is very important, moving from the future and distant spaces. thinking about the benefits of engagement are also very important, that it isn't just about sacrificing this and that. It is about enhancing our lives and livelihoods going forward. Creatively providing spaces for empowerment. This can manifest in a variety of ways, for instance, through students with whom we work, perhaps, or communities with whom we engage, and providing those spaces for them to find their voices. So again, extending out past science and solely the scientific way of knowing, or even that dominant way of knowing, through youth movements. They need not carry a PhD in their pocket in order to have really important and valuable insights to share. And thinking about the fossils among us with these contrarian communities too are largely older white men. And this has been documented by Riley Dunlop and others about cool dudes, as they've been called. And thinking about that diversity and strength of diversity of empowering people that then debilitate this perhaps archaic perspective among many contrarians that are predominantly older white men. And then last, just really thinking about moving from that 20th century communications environment of dumbing it down, of really just only relying on science or largely relying on science, to equip ourselves in a 21st century communication environment of these many different pathways to engage, find common ground, and enhance productive action. So being authentic, there's all kinds of examples. Here in the United States context, I'll just say that I provide one example here in West Virginia to address coal and mountaintop removal, that among West Virginians, using trusted sources, those that are within their community, are much more effective than, say, others of us, me as a researcher in Boulder, Colorado, going to West Virginia and trying to make progress is not, it is more limited. And so being authentic, valuing those elements of trust are very important. So just to kind of wrap up my comments, I certainly could always say a whole lot more about these things, but things are not what they used to be, and in many cases that's a good thing, right? That nostalgia is highly overrated. But in the case of things are not what they used to be, we've seen, if you're younger than 35 years old, you haven't lived on this planet with a cooler than average month here on the planet, that we are experiencing changes unlike we've experienced before, here and now. On the left-hand side is just some representation of atmospheric temperatures increasing. On the right-hand side, upper heat content. I put this forward and note some irony of relying on the science to tell you that things aren't the way they used to be. There are ways in which we need to start to grow and build imagery beyond the science to represent things not being the way they used to be. And this is part of that work in creative communications. And just to conclude too, thinking about still asking ourselves whether the scale of our responses are matching the scale of the challenges we have before us. And the short answer is no. We are still continuing to do good, important work. I put up a link back into the themes of this conference, some work that Nuria had led on, thinking about dominant counterframes and influential contrarian European think tanks. But I think, Bob Brule had pointed this out towards the beginning of our meeting yesterday, that we still know very little about what are the workings within these contrarian communities. And so, the short answer to this general question is no. The short answer to this, to the scale of our responses and doing work to better understand and to better counteract contrarian discourse in the public arena, we are nowhere near matching the scale of the challenges that we face. I know that we've talked a bit about some of the recent developments, Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, just in the last, say, 24 to 48 hours, which can point to ways in which there are changes afoot, but sustained behavioral engagement, again, to refer to Suzanne Mosier's, the quote I pulled from her earlier, that kind of sustained engagement within our research communities are critically needed. And that's where I think I just will conclude by saying that's where there is so much value in the work that Nuria, Jose, and others are doing through THINKClima. So important through the Climate Social Science Network that Timmons Roberts and Bob Ruler are leading at Brown University. I'd like to think that through the book that I've written and through, say, Media and Climate Change Observatory that we have based here at the University of Colorado, but we track media around the world in 13 languages with 28 researchers actually in the team at 10 different institutions, that hopefully we're also adding value to this work. And these are the conversations, even on Zoom, these are the conversations that are critical to us moving forward. So I thank you very much. Thank you for asking me to share my perspective here. And I will welcome your comments and any questions.